Dr. Snow Brain Health Show. Today we're going to be talking about inside Einstein's brain, and I'm joined by Dr. Alan Snow, who is very interested in Albert Einstein. For no other reason, you can know that through the image of Albert Einstein behind him. But let's start off, Dr. Snow, talk about who was Albert Einstein.
So, when I was doing a lot of research on this, I noticed there's, documentaries everywhere, and I watched a few of them. One was called Inside Einstein's Mind on Nova, but our title today is Inside Einstein's Brain, and we're trying to understand how Einstein's brain is different from other brains out there. Einstein was famous for things that he didn't even know was relevant while he was alive, including like an expanding universe, black holes, ripples in space-time, and perhaps the most bizarre, the idea that not just space, but time itself is distorted by heavy objects. He was born in Germany. He's a theoretical physicist who's widely held to be one of the greatest and most influential scientists of all time. He was born on March 14, 1879 in Ulm, Germany, and he lived to the age of 76 years and died in 1955 in Princeton, New Jersey. He died of a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. He smoked a lot. And he was a pipe smoker, and what I read is that smoking makes you 8 times more likely to develop aneurysm. A little bit about factoids about Einstein. He was a Swiss citizen. He completed his PhD in physics at the University of Zurich. And in 1905, when he was 26 years old, he published his first 4 papers in a journal, Annalen der Physik. I guess it's a physics journal, including his work on, we'll talk about it, E equals mc squared. We're going to talk about that. And he also did work on the photoelectric effect, which won him the Nobel Prize in 1921. He was only 42 years old when he won the Nobel Prize.
So, what would you say, what was Albert Einstein most famous for?
So he had a lot of famous attributes. The theory of general relativity, he published this work in 1915, explaining how gravity affects the fabric of space-time, and special relativity argued that space and time are connected, but that theory didn't acknowledge the existence of gravity. So Einstein spent a decade determining that particularly massive objects warp the fabric of space-time, a distortion that manifests as gravity. So, I looked into this. I actually had an A in physics in college, so I was starting to understand some of this stuff. So, general relativity tells us that as you move away from the mass of the planet, time should speed up. And gravity, the distortion of space and time, becomes weaker as you move away from the surface of the planet. Now, I saw an interesting experiment that they actually had on Nova, that they had these clocks that are very precise, down to a nanosecond, and they had 2 of them. They went to the top of the mountain, and they compared it to a clock at sea level, and they looked at the time of the clock at the top of the mountain, and their theory is that it's going to speed up because it's moving away from a large planet. This experiment was actually done in a Nova episode called Inside Einstein's Mind. And get this, the clock that was on top of the mountain was found to be 20 nanoseconds ahead of the sea level clock. Imagine that they had this down to the billionth of a second, and they could actually see that time is changing as you move further away from the planet. And what I was reading about is that, your GPS in different areas of uses the results of general relativity when you navigate in your car, and you should be giving a thanks for Albert Einstein for that. So everything in our life is made from matter, but not black holes. Black holes are made from warped space and time and nothing else. And a black hole is kind of a cool thing to understand. It's an object that's spherical, like a star or like the Earth, and it has a sharp boundary around it called the horizon, through which nothing can come out. So it casts a shadow on whatever is behind it. There's a distortion of starlight around the black hole. And today we actually have evidence suggesting that there are millions of black holes in our galaxy alone. Also, part of his theory was about the Big Bang theory, which, Stephen Hawking also did work on that the universe is expanding and galaxies are actually moving away from us. And there is evidence that the universe is expanding faster and faster. And this was also part of Einstein's general relativity. E equals mc squared also is very famous from Einstein. If you ever went to school in physics class, E equals mc squared states that energy and matter are basically the same thing, just in different forms. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So that equation is amazing. The equation says that energy and mass, which is matter, are interchangeable, and they are different forms of the same thing. Also, Einstein did a lot of work on the photoelectric effect, which won him the Nobel Prize in 1921. The photoelectric effect is when light shines on a material and it causes electrons to be emitted from its surface. The electrons that are emitted are called photoelectrons. He's also, you watched that film last year, which won the Academy Award, Oppenheimer. Einstein was involved to some extent, but the U.S. Army Intelligence Office actually denied Einstein a security clearance, and it's because he wasn't in favor of the use of atomic weapons. So you remember there's scenes where he's sort of talking to Oppenheimer in the park one day, and he's sort of, talking to him about that he didn't like it, that the U.S. was making an atomic weapon. So that was in the movie Oppenheimer. And at the end of World War II, which is really interesting, Einstein and both Oppenheimer lived and worked in Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Study. And Einstein became a professor there while Oppenheimer was its director and a professor of physics from 1947 to 1966. Get this, they had their offices down the hall from each other after World War II. So quite interesting stories about Einstein's life.
Yeah, a lot of brain power in one building.
That's right.
So where does Albert Einstein's journey start? Like where you talked about where he was born, but what was he like? Was he a prodigy from a young age? Like, what can you tell about the story of his childhood?
So when he was young, his mother tended the house, and he had a sister called Maja. And he actually was a late bloomer. He didn't speak until the age of 2. And he had extreme temper tantrums. He would throw things. He even threw a chair at a teacher once. So he wasn't he was good in math and physics, but other stuff he didn't care about, and he was even skipping school. What I found interesting when I dove into his life, at the age of 23, in 1902, Einstein worked at the patent office. I know a lot about patents. That's where, he had access to originality of new devices. He was looking at clocks across the world, one of the technologies that passed through his office, how they tried to coordinate, time in different countries and all that kind of stuff. So he was kind of innovative with seeing the latest things at the patent office, all the latest technologies. And of course, it gave him a lot of things to think about as he was looking into relativity and gravity and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So how does this all tie into brain health? I know that we've talked a little bit about Einstein's IQ, but what can you tell us about how what can we learn from Einstein and others like him about the nature of the brain and what's so significant about the brain?
Well, let's talk about IQ. So guess what Einstein's score was? And I had to look this up. So Einstein and Stephen Hawking, remember him, the physicist? They both had IQs around 160. 160 is incredible. So average intelligence has scores of about 85 to 114. Above average or bright is 150 and 129. This is the IQ score. Moderately gifted is 130 to 144, and highly gifted is 145 to 159. So Einstein had an IQ of 160, so did Stephen Hawking. Elon Musk, for example, has an IQ between 155 and 160. Bill Gates, about 150. Mark Zuckerberg, 152. Steve Jobs, 160 also. But, you know, somebody who had the most incredible IQ was Isaac Newton, 190 to 200. Wow, he blew it off the charts. And even Oppenheimer had a high IQ, it was 135. So Einstein was right up there with one of the most brilliant minds of all time.
So what do we know about Albert Einstein's brain from autopsy? And who did the autopsy?
So get this. So Einstein died, and then the pathologist who was on call was named Thomas Harvey, and he conducted Einstein's autopsy. And most of his body was cremated shortly after his death. His ashes were spread at undisclosed location, but Harvey decided to remove Einstein's brain at autopsy for further study, and there's a debate whether he actually had permission from the family or didn't. And some people believe, you know, he actually stole Einstein's brain, and he wanted to look into Einstein's intelligence. So that's the first thing that happened, is there was an actually autopsy. You know, and as a neuropathologist, I was part of the Alzheimer's Disease Center at University of Washington, and I used to help with obtaining the brain. So basically they take out the brain and then they cut it and they put it in paraformaldehyde or formalin, and maybe some of the brain is actually in frozen too for frozen sectioning. But in that time they were using formaldehyde to preserve the brain. And then what they eventually do is they put it into paraffin blocks, and then they could cut thin sections of paraffin and then look under the microscope. And that's basically what Harvey was doing.
Yeah, and there were no internal review boards. That's a much more recent invention in terms of the ethics of that kind of research.
Right.
So what happened to his brain? Like, what did Harvey and company do with his brain?
And he died in Princeton Hospital in New Jersey. Imagine that, he was living in New Jersey after all that. His brain was preserved, they photographed it, measured it, and then a colleague of Thomas Harvey cut most of it into 240 blocks. So these are like embedded in paraffin and then cut and mounted on microscopic slides. And according to the BBC, the pathologist had created 12 sets of 200 slides each containing tissue samples that are indexed to those paraffin blocks. And get this, the brain was missing for 23 years. So nobody knew what happened to it. And then there was an editor who was dispatched. His name was Stephen Levy, and he actually tracked down where the brain was, and he found Einstein's brain, and he talked to Harvey that he wanted to get some of the brain and see what was going on. So in 1985, Harvey published the first study of Einstein's brain, and he claimed that it had an abnormal proportion of two types of cells, that's neurons and glia. And you remember we talked about neurons, they're doing the connections between, to remember thought from different parts of your brain. And the glia, the microglia and astrocytes, the glia are like the Pac-Man of the brain, they clean up the garbage, and the astrocytes sort of wall off and they scar around areas that are damaged. But it was interesting, they started counting the neurons and glia in Einstein's brain. And in 1985, when they started to finally publish this, it was 35 years after Einstein's death. Amazing.
That is amazing. So tell me a little bit more about these two types of cells and what else they found with Einstein's brain.
So there was a neuroanatomist, his name is Marion Diamond, it's a her. Marion Diamond at the University of California, Berkeley. And I started looking up these papers. She published in Experimental Neurology and claimed that Einstein's brain had more glial cells for every neuron compared to a control group of brains. And glial cells get their name from the Greek word that is glue, and they sort of fix neurons into place, and they keep them supplied with oxygen and nutrients. So the glia is like the supporting helping cells. And Diamond previously showed in rats that a stimulating environment can lead to an increase in glial cell count. And that's what they believe Einstein had, is that it was such a stimulating life environment that he actually had about 4-to-1 glial cells for every neuron.
That's really interesting. So have there been subsequent studies that have happened on Einstein's brain or other types of analysis as new kinds of research have come forward and we have new ways of analyzing the brain?
In 1996, Britt Anderson at University of Alabama in Birmingham published the studies on Einstein's prefrontal cortex. And I'll show, when I talk about areas of the brain, I'll show images of where that is. And he found that the number of neurons was equivalent to brains in a control group. So I think the way they did these studies is they had age-matched controls around the same age as Einstein. But they found that his brain neurons were more tightly packed. So although the number didn't change, it tended to be more tightly packed. And they believe that perhaps that's allowing for faster processing of information. That's pretty interesting. And then another paper in 1996, a Lancet paper by Sandra Wiltison from McMaster University in Canada, said that Einstein's inferior parietal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for spatial cognition and mathematical thought, was wider than normal and seems to be better integrated. Einstein's brain, get this, was 15% wider than other brains. In other words, he had a bigger brain, more connections, more ability to do spatial thinking, mathematical thought. And the researchers believe that these unique characteristics may allow for better connections between neurons, which is important for math and spatial reasoning. Other papers in 2009, and I'm going to show all these papers on the screen because I actually downloaded them. Falk wrote a paper in Frontiers and Evolutions of Neuroscience entitled New Information About Einstein's Brain, and some of the things that I talked about. And then in 2012, the eminent anthropologist Dean Falk did a complete audit of Einstein's brain, naming every convolution and crevice, and found a number of unusual features. Perhaps the most striking is that Einstein had an extra ridge on his midfrontal lobe. That part is used for making plans and memory. Most people have 3 ridges. Einstein had 4. She also found Einstein's parietal lobes were dramatically asymmetric, and he had a knob on his right motor strip. And this latter feature is called the sign of omega, and it's thought to be correlated to musicians who use their left hands. Get this, Einstein played the violin when he was younger. So they think a lot of that had to do with, it's interesting because we talked about this, that you could have new thoughts that can rewire your brain, and you could physically see that there's a change in the actual grooves of the brain. Guess what? By learning new things, you can actually create new neurons. So you're balancing the bad stuff with some of the good stuff. And there are studies now showing that if you're learning new things that are something really new to your brain, you're actually rewiring some of your brain. And physically, there's actually increases in neurons and neuroplasticity. So the brain is adapting physically to what you're doing that's new. Well, they found this with Einstein. So because of all his, thoughts and spatial acquisition, learning, and mathematical formulations, it actually probably reshaped his brain, and that's what they were finding. And so that fits very well into some of our other videos where we talk about sort of the laws of attraction, how you could reshape your thoughts, and how your brain is actually physically changing. And lastly, in 2013, Fox did another study, and he talked about Einstein's unusual corpus callosum, the bundle of fibers that connect the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And the researcher found Einstein's was thicker than in the control groups, suggesting enhanced cooperation between left and right brain hemispheres. And this paper was called The Cerebral Cortex of Albert Einstein, a description and preliminary analysis of unpublished photographs. And it was published by Fock, Lepore, and No in Brain in 2013. So there's a number of studies, that have been published, analyzing everything about Einstein's brain.
So if you want to see pictures, look at that last study. But where would we go if we wanted to see Einstein's brain today?
Could you believe it that it's in a museum 60 years later? The only permanent place to see a piece of Einstein's brain is the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. So have you ever been? Show pictures. They actually have sections of his brain, and it's pretty amazing to actually see. I'm sure there's a lot of researchers still working on this and doing a lot of studies on this.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So I know you're a big fan of Albert Einstein. So do you have any favorite quotes or any favorite pieces of his work that you like to return to?
So get this, and I just found this on the internet when I was researching this. There was a quote found on the blackboard in Einstein's office, and I love this quote. So it goes, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." That's a good one. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts.
Yeah, that is a good one.
It sounds like our life, right? Not everything can be counted on that it counts, and what really counts can't be counted.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you one thing that you can count on is that we will continue to talk about brain health and continue these kinds of conversations. So, thank you, Dr. Snow. I appreciate your time today, and looking forward to another conversation soon.
Thanks a lot. And people who have not subscribed to our channel, Dr. Snow Brain Health, we're putting up new content each and every week. Our subscribers are growing like crazy. Hopefully some of you people will be joining our channel and watching the Dr. Snow Brain Health show each and every month. Thanks a lot, Scott.
Thank you.